If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The weight of the cold iron shackles pressing against his ankles seemed to mirror the heavy burden that pressed on his chest each day. Michael Carter, 35 years old, had spent the last 5 years of his life on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the cold, sterile corridor, flickering like a fading hope that he might someday walk free again. The crime Michael had been convicted of was brutal, a savage murder of 2 women in a downtown post office. The details were horrific, described endlessly on news outlets and social media, as if to make sure no one ever forgot the image of the victims, their faces frozen in terror, the blood-stained walls. Michael had been accused of killing them in cold blood, and the evidence seemed to point directly at him. His fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, and witnesses swore they saw him at the scene. But there was one glaring problem. Michael had an alibi, one that should have cleared his name immediately. He had been working a late shift at a warehouse across town. He had even clocked in with his boss that night, an irrefutable fact that had never been brought up during the trial. His defense team, overwhelmed and underfunded, had failed to use it. Instead, the prosecutor had painted him as a monster, a black man with a criminal record who could easily snap and commit such atrocities. The media chewed him up, turning the courtroom into a stage where they performed his guilt before he could even speak for himself. It didn't matter that the murder weapon was found in his left hand. Michael was right-handed. None of this mattered to the system that had already convicted him in the eyes of the public. Michael was guilty before the jury even had a chance to deliberate. As Michael sat in his tiny cell, the stench of despair filled the air. He was a man sentenced to die, his last breath scheduled to be taken in the execution chamber. His family had fought tirelessly for his release, but the world had already written him off. The judge who sentenced him, Judge William Jacobs, had been known for his hard stance on crime and his indifference to the flaws in the justice system. The prosecutor, Catherine Wells, had built her career on high-profile convictions, and Michael's case was another notch in her belt. But Michael wasn't ready to give up yet. His mother, a devout woman who had always believed in his innocence, had visited him every week for the last 5 years. Despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him, she refused to stop believing that one day the truth would come to light. It was her unwavering faith that kept Michael going. Every night, he would lay on the hard, uncomfortable mattress and stare at the ceiling, praying for a miracle. But miracles didn't come easily in places like San Quentin. The longer he stayed in the grim reality of death row, the more he realized that the system had never cared about justice, only about appearances, about keeping the machine running smoothly, and about making sure the innocent stayed quiet while the guilty walked free. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud clanging of bars being pulled open. His door was unlocked and an officer stood there with a smirk on his face. "Your lawyer's here," the officer grunted. "Not that it's going to do you much good." Michael sat up, feeling a wave of both relief and dread. Relief, because it meant someone was still fighting for him, but dread because he knew that the odds of the legal system overturning his conviction were slim to none. His lawyer, Emily Thompson, entered the cell, her face pale but determined. She was young, barely out of law school, but she had a fire in her that Michael admired. Emily had taken on his case against the odds, working late nights, poring over evidence that everyone else had long abandoned. She was his last hope, and she knew it. "Michael, how are you holding up?" she asked, sitting across from him, her eyes scanning the sterile, bleak surroundings of his cell. "I'm alive," he replied with a dry chuckle, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. "But for how much longer, I don't know." Emily looked at him with a deep sadness in her eyes, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I've been doing everything I can, Michael. But this case, it's been mishandled from the start. The evidence that could exonerate you has been ignored. We've been getting nowhere with the state appeals, and the governor's office isn't exactly eager to take up the case." Michael stared at the concrete floor, fists clenched. "I didn't kill those women. I didn't. And they don't care. Nobody cares. Not really. They've already decided who I am, and that's all that matters. I care, Emily said firmly, her voice steady. "We both know the truth, and we can fight for it. We have to. You didn't do this, Michael, and I won't stop until we prove that." But in a system that was so deeply flawed, the truth seemed like a distant dream. Michael's case was just one of many, a symbol of how the poor and the marginalized were often swept aside in the pursuit of efficiency, in the name of keeping the public at ease with the idea of justice. The pressure on Emily was mounting, and Michael knew that if they didn't get something substantial soon, there would be no way to stop the execution. As Emily gathered her things to leave, she paused. "I've been doing some research, Michael. I think I've found something, a new angle to pursue. I can't promise anything, but I'll be back as soon as I have more information." Michael nodded, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. If Emily could find even a small crack in the case, it might be enough to bring the whole thing crashing down. As she left, Michael sat back on the narrow cot, feeling the cold walls close in around him. He had no illusions about the difficulty of his situation. The system had already convicted him in the eyes of everyone who mattered. But he wasn't done fighting. He wasn't done being heard. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to expose the truth, not only for himself, but for everyone else who had ever been crushed under the weight of an unjust system. The prison was a place where dreams went to die. Michael Carter had spent 5 long years of his life within its unforgiving walls, and every day felt like an eternity. The days blurred together, painful, monotonous, and filled with the same droning routine, the loud clang of bars, the shout of corrections officers, the cold, stale food. It was a system designed to break you down, and that's exactly what it had done to the men who called this place home. Michael's cell, cramped and poorly lit, had become his world. It was a constant reminder that the world outside had abandoned him. But despite the crushing despair, there was still something inside him that refused to die, a flicker of the man he used to be, a man who once had hopes and dreams beyond the steel walls that confined him. It had been a week since Emily Thompson had last visited him. Each day, he waited for her to return, but there had been no word, no sign of progress. It seemed that his case was just another lost cause to the system. But then, on the morning of the 8th day, a surprising visitor arrived at his cell. Officer Carl Jenkins, one of the few who had ever shown Michael any semblance of respect in this hellhole. "Michael, I need to talk to you," Officer Jenkins said, his voice low and urgent. Michael stood up from the cot, still groggy from the restless night he'd spent wondering if Emily was actually going to pull through for him. "What's going on, Carl?" The officer hesitated before continuing. "I don't know how to tell you this, but there's someone out there trying to help you." Michael's heart raced, a sudden surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. "What do you mean? Who?" "A reporter. A big-time investigative journalist named Lisa Hayes. She's been digging into your case. She's been asking questions, reviewing the evidence, and she's not the only one. I've heard rumors of a possible shift in the case, something that could—" Carl was cut off by the sound of the loud clanging of the cell door opening. Another officer, this one a younger man, stepped in. "Officer Jenkins, you need to get back to your post. Now," the younger officer barked, eyeing Michael with a cold indifference. Carl exchanged a brief, tense look with Michael before stepping back. "I'll keep in touch. Just keep your head down and don't make any noise for now, okay?" Michael nodded, barely believing what he had just heard. A reporter? A shift in his case? Could it be true? Was there a chance for him after all? As Carl left the cell, Michael sank back down onto his cot, his mind racing. The reality of the situation still felt surreal. It wasn't that Michael didn't believe in justice, it was just that he'd seen too much of the system to trust it. He knew how it worked. The innocent were often overlooked, forgotten in the shuffle. He had seen countless other men come and go, each with their own story of being wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. But this time felt different. Lisa Hayes. The name stuck with him. If she was really investigating his case, it meant that someone important, believed that he was innocent. For the first time in years, a real sense of hope bloomed inside him. But it wasn't just about the hope. It was about what this meant for the injustice he'd suffered. For 5 years, Michael had lived with the crushing weight of being a convicted murderer. He had been demonized, stripped of his dignity, and reduced to a mere statistic. But if Lisa Hayes and the others were on his side, it meant that the truth could come out. It meant the corrupt system that had failed him could be toppled. The problem was that the clock was ticking. The prison system wasn't designed to give second chances. The trial had been a farce, and Michael knew that no one cared about the truth anymore. The public had already made up their minds. His execution date loomed ever closer, and the pressure to act quickly was unbearable. His life, his very existence, was on the line. One misstep could mean the difference between life and death. 2 days later, Emily Thompson arrived again. This time her face was grim, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but her demeanor was more determined than ever. "Michael, I've got news," she said, sitting down across from him in the small visitation room. "I've been working non-stop. We've got something big." Michael's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Lisa Hayes. She's been speaking with key witnesses who were never interviewed during your trial. She's found discrepancies in the evidence that were covered up." Emily leaned forward, her eyes locked with his. "The blood on the knife, it doesn't match your DNA, Michael. It never did." Michael blinked in disbelief. What do you mean?" "The knife that was supposedly used in the killings, the one with your prints, has a completely different blood type. It's a type that doesn't match yours. Lisa got the forensics report, and we have the proof." Michael could hardly process what Emily was saying. "But why wasn't this evidence brought up in court? Why wasn't this considered?" "Because they didn't want it to be. The prosecutor's office buried it. Your defense attorney was either too incompetent or too overwhelmed to catch it. It was never investigated properly. But now, thanks to Lisa, we've got the proof." Michael sat back, his mind spinning. This was the break he had been waiting for, the proof he needed to prove his innocence. The key that could unlock his cell and set him free. "There's more," Emily continued, her voice shaking with the excitement of discovery. "The eyewitnesses, the ones who identified you, they were coerced into testifying. Lisa has tracked down the person who gave them the confirmation. It's a whole mess of corruption." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "So what happens now?" Emily stood up and paced the room, clearly nervous but energized. "We file for a new trial, but we need to act fast. We have to move before they start covering up even more. Lisa is pushing hard to get this out to the media. She's already reached out to a national news outlet. If the story breaks, they won't be able to ignore it." Michael's eyes were filled with a new fire, a burning desire to fight, to not let his story end in the prison yard. "Let's do it. Let's take them down. I'm not going down without a fight." As Emily prepared to leave, she squeezed his hand. "We're not done yet, Michael. There's still a long road ahead, but this is the beginning of your freedom." Michael sat alone in the stark confines of his cell, the walls closing in as his thoughts raced. The news Emily had given him still echoed in his mind, bouncing around like a pinball inside his skull. The knife, the one that was supposed to have sealed his fate, didn't have his DNA on it. The blood on it was from a different person. That should have been the bombshell at his trial, the key piece of evidence that would have set him free. But it had been deliberately overlooked, buried beneath a mountain of lies and manipulation. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no time for dwelling in anger or frustration. The clock was ticking. Every day that passed brought him closer to his execution date, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had a plan. The following week, the news that Lisa Hayes, the investigative journalist, was digging into his case spread like wildfire. There were whispers in the prison yard, rumors that Emily had secured a major breakthrough. The entire atmosphere inside the prison seemed to shift. Even the hardened inmates who never cared about anyone else's fate began to take notice. "Hey, Carter, you really gonna make it out of here?" one of the men asked as he leaned against the wall outside Michael's cell, his voice hushed with uncertainty. "The word is that there's something big happening on the outside." Michael didn't respond immediately. He was thinking. The tide was beginning to turn, and he could feel the pressure mounting. The media was going to catch wind of this, and with the evidence from Lisa Hayes, the entire case was under scrutiny. It was a game changer. But it wasn't enough to just have the media behind him. It wasn't enough to have Lisa or Emily working overtime. Michael had to take control of his own fate. He had to do what they couldn't. That meant escape. For the last 5 years, Michael had been biding his time, learning the ins and outs of the prison, its routines, the guards, the schedules, the weak points. He had even befriended a few of the guards, feeding them just enough information about himself to appear harmless, to fit in with the system. But beneath the surface, he had been meticulously planning. He had become the invisible man, unnoticed, forgotten, a man who no longer mattered. The guards overlooked him, the inmates kept their distance, and the prison system had written him off as just another statistic. It was the perfect cover. And now it was time to use that cover. It was a late evening when Michael made his move. He had spent the entire day in the prison yard, pretending to be just another man who had accepted his fate, but inside his mind was clear. He had everything he needed: a makeshift key card, stolen from a naive guard, and a set of old blueprints of the prison. The escape route was narrow, but it was possible. He had spent weeks observing the guards' shift changes, noting the times when the surveillance cameras were checked, and identifying the areas with the least security. It had taken a lot of patience, but Michael was used to waiting. He had been waiting for justice his entire life. Now he was going to make sure he got it. That night, he waited until the guards began their rounds. It was a quiet shift, as usual. Most of the guards were lethargic, worn down by the endless cycle of prison life. He slipped from his cell like a shadow, moving silently through the darkened corridors. The air was thick with tension as he navigated the prison's maze-like hallways. He had done his homework. He knew where the cameras were, and he knew where the blind spots were. The key card, clumsily cut and bent out of shape, was just enough to get him through the security doors. But then came the most dangerous part, the final stretch to the outer walls. It was the longest distance to cover, and there were no shortcuts. One wrong move, one misstep, and it was over. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the last barrier, the perimeter fence. He knew this was his one shot. If he didn't make it, he would be buried in a hole for the rest of his life. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty halls as he reached the outer yard. He took a deep breath and approached the fence. This was the moment where his fate would be decided. He had already planned his route carefully. He knew there was a small gap in the fence where the guards rarely checked. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance he had. The fence was rusted, but solid. He pulled himself up with his fingers digging into the steel mesh, his breath ragged in his throat. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the yard, and Michael froze, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder. He could hear the guards talking in the distance, their conversation rising and falling with each step. His hands trembled as he continued his climb. He had to stay calm. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the top and slipped through the gap in the fence, landing softly on the other side. His heart was racing as he dashed into the darkness of the night, the bright lights of the prison behind him fading into the distance. For the first time in years, Michael Carter was free. A dangerous freedom. The next morning, the prison erupted into chaos. Michael's escape was discovered just after dawn, and the news spread like wildfire. The prison guards were in a panic, scrambling to secure the perimeter. But it was too late. Michael was already miles away from the prison. He had done it. But freedom wasn't as sweet as it seemed. Michael knew the moment he left the prison gates, he had entered a new kind of battle. The authorities would stop at nothing to capture him. They would stop at nothing to silence him. But Michael wasn't afraid. He had already beaten the system once. He could do it again. He found an old ally on the outside, a former journalist turned hacker, who helped him cover his tracks. Together, they moved in the shadows, gathering evidence and reaching out to people who could help. Michael knew he wasn't safe yet, but this was only the beginning. He had a story to tell, and he was going to make sure the world knew the truth. The air was thick with tension as Michael Carter ran through the streets of the city, his heart racing. He had spent years behind bars, but now, for the first time in forever, he was free. His clothes were torn, his face a mask of exhaustion, but he didn't dare slow down. He had no choice but to keep running. Every minute that passed, every breath he took, brought him closer to the brink of capture. The guards back at the prison weren't the only ones after him. The moment he escaped, news of his flight spread to the media and the police, who began to coordinate a massive manhunt. Law enforcement agencies, from local cops to federal agents, were all on high alert. The clock was ticking, and Michael knew it. As he moved through the streets, Michael kept a low profile. He couldn't afford to be seen, not now. His face was plastered all over the news as the escaped convict, the man who had allegedly killed 2 women in cold blood. But Michael knew the truth. The truth that had been twisted, distorted, and hidden by the very people who had condemned him. He thought of Emily and Lisa, working tirelessly to uncover the corruption that had led to his wrongful conviction. Without them, he would never have stood a chance. They had given him hope, and now it was his turn to fight back. He had no money, no identification, and no allies except those he could trust. But Michael had one thing that could help him: his connections in the underground world. Years ago, he had made a few friends, people who had helped him survive the hell of prison. They were the ones who could get him the tools he needed: new clothes, an alias, forged documents, and guide him through the perilous path of escape. Michael made a call, his voice low and urgent. The number was untraceable, a burner phone he'd kept for emergencies. A gruff voice answered on the other end. "It's Michael. I need your help." For days, Michael stayed hidden in the shadows, avoiding the police at all costs. He knew the heat was on. He couldn't afford to take risks. But every night he would meet with his underground contacts, gather new information, and stay one step ahead of the law. Through the network of allies he had cultivated over the years, Michael learned more about the corruption surrounding his case. There were whispers of a massive conspiracy involving influential figures, people who had the power to manipulate the judicial system and frame innocent men for their own gain. Michael knew he couldn't just run. He couldn't simply disappear into the night. He had to expose the truth, bring the corrupt to justice, and clear his name once and for all. He would do whatever it took. Weeks passed, and Michael's movements became more calculated, more deliberate. Every step he took brought him closer to the people who had framed him. He used every piece of information he could gather, piecing together the puzzle of his wrongful conviction. Then, one night, Michael finally got the break he had been waiting for. He managed to track down the man behind the conspiracy, attorney Greg Daniels, the one who had ensured that all the fabricated evidence was used to convict him. Daniels had been paid off, hired by a group of powerful elites who wanted Michael out of the picture. As Michael closed in on Daniels, he couldn't help but feel a sense of rage burning inside him. The injustice of it all, the way his life had been stolen from him, it was almost too much to bear. But he was determined to make it right. The confrontation happened in a darkened alley, far from prying eyes. Michael approached Daniels, his footsteps silent, as he moved toward the man who had orchestrated his downfall. Daniels was just as smug as Michael had imagined, leaning against a brick wall, his face lit by the faint glow of a street lamp. "Carter," Daniels said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've been quite the nuisance. You should have stayed in prison." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "You tried to kill me, but I'm still here, and I'm going to make sure the world knows the truth." Daniels chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it. "The truth? What truth? The truth that you're nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game? You think you can take down the people I work for? They'll destroy you." Michael stepped closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "No, Daniels. I'm going to take you down. I'm going to expose you and everyone who's been pulling the strings." As Michael prepared to confront the final pieces of the conspiracy, he knew there was no going back. The stakes were higher than ever before. But he had already sacrificed too much, and he wasn't about to let the powerful elites win. In the final hours of his journey, he made contact with Emily, who had gathered enough evidence to blow the entire conspiracy wide open. They had found Daniel's ties to the corrupt officials, the false evidence, and the money that had changed hands to seal Michael's fate. With this information, Michael planned to confront the elites, to expose them for what they had done. But as the walls of the conspiracy began to crumble, he found himself facing one final hurdle: the police. They had caught wind of his plans, and now they were closing in on him. Michael knew it wouldn't be long before the authorities tried to take him down, to stop him from speaking the truth. But he was ready. For the first time in his life, he was going to fight back. He was going to take down the corrupt system that had wrongfully condemned him. The night air hung heavy with a sense of dread as Michael moved through the narrow streets, barely a shadow among the city's structures. He had always been able to move quickly, to disappear in plain sight. But now, every moment was a calculated risk, a gamble for his life. With Emily's help, the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Michael now had what he needed to expose the vast conspiracy that had imprisoned him for years. The elites behind his framing had underestimated his resolve. They thought that the system they controlled was impenetrable, that they could dispose of him without any consequences. But Michael was no longer the man they had convicted, a powerless, forgotten man behind bars. He had become something else, a symbol of defiance against the unjust system that had stolen his life. The next step was critical. He had to confront those responsible, and he knew that doing so would cost him everything. With every move he made, Michael could feel the walls closing in. He had become a target, not just for the police, but for the very people who had orchestrated his downfall. Daniels, the corrupt lawyer, was their puppet. He had sold Michael's fate for a price, but now it was time to collect. And those who had manipulated Daniels, those hidden in the shadows of power, would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Michael knew he had little time. The evidence Emily had gathered, combined with his own knowledge, could bring the system to its knees. But the elites, backed by the police and government agencies, would go to extreme lengths to ensure that Michael was silenced before he could expose them. As Michael sat in the dingy apartment that had become his hideout, he ran through his options. His team was ready. The hacker, the informants, and Emily, each of them had a part to play in this final act. But the danger they all faced was immense. The authorities were closing in, and if they weren't careful, they would be caught. Emily had been invaluable. She had pieced together the connections, traced the money, and uncovered the deep corruption in the police force, the judiciary, and the elite businessmen who had controlled it all. But now, the only way to get the truth out was to expose it to the public, to bring it into the light. Michael knew the risks. If they were caught, they would all be branded as criminals, traitors, or worse. Just as the plan was beginning to come together, Michael received a call. It was from one of his underground allies, a voice trembling with panic. "Michael, it's bad. They've found Emily." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Emily had been the one person who had believed in him when no one else would. She had sacrificed everything to help him, and now the very people who had framed him were going after her. Without wasting a second, Michael grabbed his things and sprinted for the door. He couldn't afford to waste time. If they had her, it would only be a matter of hours before they found him too. He would have to act quickly. Michael had always been resourceful. He had spent years in prison, learning how to survive, how to read people, how to disappear. But now, all of those skills were put to the test in a way he had never anticipated. The trail was cold, but he knew where to go. He reached Emily's apartment complex, his breath heavy in his chest as he slipped through the back entrance. His mind raced, his eyes scanning every corner, every darkened hallway. He had to be quick, and he had to be silent. As he reached her apartment, Michael could hear muffled voices, two men talking, their words filled with frustration. They were looking for something, but Michael wasn't about to let them find it. He wasn't about to let them silence Emily. With quick, silent movements, Michael took out one of the men with a precision that surprised even him. The other man heard the commotion and rushed to the door, but Michael was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, knocking the wind out of him, and quickly secured his position. Emily was inside, her hands tied, her face bruised but determined. When she saw Michael, her eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Michael nodded. "You didn't think I'd leave you behind, did you?" He quickly untied her, helping her to her feet. They didn't have much time. The second man was coming too, and they needed to leave before backup arrived. Together, they moved through the shadows, out of the apartment and into the night. Emily clung to Michael, her strength bolstered by his presence. They had made it this far together. Now it was time to finish what they had started. Michael had always been resourceful. He had spent years in prison learning how to survive, how to read people, how to disappear. But now, all of those skills were put to the test in a way he had never anticipated. The trail was cold, but he knew where to go. He reached Emily's apartment complex, his breath heavy in his chest as he slipped through the back entrance. His mind raced, his eyes scanning every corner, every darkened hallway. He had to be quick, and he had to be silent. As he reached her apartment, Michael could hear muffled voices. Two men talking, their words filled with frustration. They were looking for something, but Michael wasn't about to let them find it. He wasn't about to let them silence Emily. With quick, silent movements, Michael took out one of the men with a precision that surprised even him. The other man heard the commotion and rushed to the door, but Michael was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, knocking the wind out of him, and quickly secured his position. Emily was inside, her hands tied, her face bruised but determined. When she saw Michael, her eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Michael nodded. "You didn't think I'd leave you behind, did you?" He quickly untied her, helping her to her feet. They didn't have much time. The second man was coming too, and they needed to leave before backup arrived. Together they moved through the shadows, out of the apartment, and into the night. Emily clung to Michael, her strength bolstered by his presence. They had made it this far together. Now it was time to finish what they had started. Michael, however, knew differently. He had spent too many years in prison to let this moment slip by. He had spent too many years in the shadows, learning to survive, learning to fight. He would bring them down piece by piece, starting with Daniel's. Emily was by his side, her resolve as strong as his. Together they made their way through the building, avoiding security, using the knowledge they had gained to navigate the complex maze of offices, corridors, and vaults. Every step brought them closer to the truth. The confrontation with Daniels was brutal. He had no intention of letting Michael expose the truth, but Michael had already prepared for this moment. With the evidence they had gathered, evidence that connected Daniels to the corrupt officials, the fabricated evidence, and the murders he had orchestrated, Michael finally had the leverage he needed. "I've got the proof," Michael said, his voice cold and determined. "This ends now." Daniels sneered, but Michael could see the fear in his eyes. The once proud lawyer knew his empire was crumbling, and there was no escape. The elites he had worked for had already begun to turn on him, and now he was cornered, desperate. "Do you think they'll let you get away with this?" Daniels spat. "You think you'll make it out alive?" Michael's expression didn't change. "I'm not the one running anymore. You are." In the end, Michael's fight for justice wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about exposing the systemic corruption that had poisoned the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public. He had fought to reclaim his life, his freedom, and his dignity, but he had also fought for the truth to be heard. As the police arrived, alerted by the chaos Michael had caused, he stood tall. The elites who had orchestrated his downfall were now exposed for the world to see. The battle was over. The system had been shattered. Emily stood beside him, her face filled with pride and relief. They had done it. Together, they had taken down the corrupt system that had nearly destroyed them both. Michael's name was finally cleared. His story became a symbol of hope for those wrongfully convicted, a reminder that even the darkest conspiracies can be brought to light. The fight for justice had been long, but it was worth it. The city would never forget Michael Carter, and neither would the powerful elites who had tried to silence him.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.